At 02:15 hours on April 6, 2026, inside a hardened command bunker 40 meters beneath Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, a secure satellite feed from a KH-13 reconnaissance platform painted a picture that made every general in the room go completely silent. The Isfahan nuclear complex, or what remained of it, was moving. Not the buildings. The buildings were rubble. US and Israeli strikes over the past 5 weeks had reduced the above-ground structure of Iran's primary nuclear facility to a field of concrete shards and twisted rebar. But the thermal imaging showed something extraordinary. Heat signatures. Multiple. Moving in patterns consistent with human activity. Deep in the underground tunnel network that had survived the bombing campaign. The same tunnels where the IAEA believed 450 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium was still buried under the rubble of Tunnel Complex Alpha. Someone was digging. The CENTCOM J2 intelligence officer turned to General Anthony Barros, commander of U.S. Central Command, and said 4 words that would define the next 96 hours. "Sir, they're going for it." Iran was trying to retrieve its own uranium, and if they succeeded, if even 50 kilograms of that material reached a reconstituted enrichment cascade somewhere in the country's vast underground network, the entire strategic justification for 5 weeks of war, the deaths of over 2,000 Iranian civilians, the wounding of 15 American soldiers at Prince Sultan Air Base, the sinking of a USK C-135 refueling tanker by an Iranian ballistic missile off the coast of Oman, all of it would have been for nothing. Because with 50 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium and a functioning centrifuge facility, Iran was roughly 3 weeks from nuclear breakout. General Barros looked at his watch, reached for the secure phone connecting him directly to the Situation Room. The call lasted 11 minutes. When he hung up, he turned to his J3 operations officer and said simply, "Execute Operation Iron Vault. 4-hour window. Go." The most dangerous ground mission in American military history had just been authorized. To understand why American paratroopers were about to jump into the middle of a country the United States was actively bombing, you need to understand what was buried under that rubble. During the final week of March 2026, IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi had told reporters in Washington that the assumption remained that the bulk of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile had not been moved, that the material, approximately 450 kilograms of uranium hexafluoride enriched to 60% purity, was still sitting inside the underground tunnel complex at Isfahan, sealed under tens of thousands of tons of concrete and steel that US bunker buster munitions had deliberately dropped on the tunnel entrances at the very start of the war. This had been intentional. The first strike package on February 28th, the opening night of the war, had not been aimed at destroying the uranium. It had been aimed at sealing it, entombing it, buying time. That strategy was now unraveling. Satellite imagery from the previous 72 hours showed Iranian engineering units, IRGC Katamal Anbiya Construction Headquarters, the same organization that had built the tunnels in the first place, deploying heavy excavation machinery to 3 separate entry points on the western perimeter of the Isfahan complex. They were working under camouflage netting, using civilian construction vehicles to disguise the activity from casual observation. But to the infrared sensors of a KH-13 at 320 kilometers altitude, the heat signatures of diesel excavator engines burning at high RPM were as visible as flares in the dark. They had already cleared 12 meters of rubble at Entry Point Whiskey 3 on the northwest corner. At the current rate of excavation, CENTCOM's engineers calculated they would breach the outer door of Tunnel Complex Alpha in approximately 18 hours. That was the window, 18 hours. Or, to put it in terms that made the generals in the bunker physically uncomfortable, 11 nuclear weapons worth of fissile material was 18 hours from potentially falling back into the hands of a regime that had just spent 5 weeks absorbing the most intense aerial bombardment in the Middle East since the Gulf War, and that now had every conceivable motivation to weaponize. Trump had been briefed at 2100 hours Washington time. His answer had taken less than 30 seconds. Go get the nuclear dust. Operation Iron Vault had been on the shelf at JSOC headquarters in Fort Bragg for 9 months. It had been written in the assumption that if diplomatic efforts failed and the war began, the uranium seizure mission would be phase 3 of a 3-phase campaign. First, air dominance. Second, destruction of IRGC ground force command structures. Third, physical extraction of the fissile material. Phases 1 and 2 were complete. Phase 3 had just been triggered 72 hours ahead of schedule. The force package was already in position. This was not improvisation. Since the first week of March, the 1st Brigade Combat Team of the 82nd Airborne Division, 3,400 paratroopers had been staged at Al Udeid and King Fahd Air Base in Saudi Arabia, preloaded with drop containers and mission-specific equipment. 12 C-17 Globemaster IIIs and 4 C-13 OJ Super Hercules aircraft had been holding on 2-hour strip alert. More critically, the tip of the spear, a 60-man element from 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, SFODD, known universally as Delta Force, had been forward deployed to a classified staging base inside Iraqi Kurdistan for the past 6 days, running rehearsals of the Isfahan tunnel layout using 3D printed models constructed from pre-war IAEA inspection photographs and satellite ground-penetrating radar data. They had been waiting for this call. At 0230 hours, the MC-130J Commando 2 aircraft carrying the Delta element, call sign Wraith 1, lifted off from the Kurdish staging base and turned southwest toward Iranian airspace at 200 feet above ground level. Flying terrain masking all the way, the aircraft's ALQ-213 electronic warfare system continuously jamming the Iranian radar bands that were still operational in the region. It would reach the Isfahan drop zone in 94 minutes. Simultaneously, 800 kilometers to the south, the flight deck of the USS Harry S. Truman Carrier Strike Group erupted into controlled chaos as 8 FA-18F Super Hornets and 4 EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft launched in a coordinated package. Their mission? Total electromagnetic suppression of every Iranian radar, communications node, and air defense battery within 200 kilometers of Isfahan. The Growlers were carrying the latest generation ALQ-99 tactical jamming system pods, each pod capable of simultaneously suppressing 14 separate frequency bands. Iran was not going to see this coming, or so the plan said. At 0312 hours, the situation changed. The E-8C Joint Stars ground surveillance aircraft orbiting at 30,000 feet over the Persian Gulf, a flying radar platform that could detect ground vehicle movement across an area the size of France, reported an anomaly 40 kilometers north of Isfahan. A column of vehicles, 18 of them, military profile, tracked vehicles consistent with T-72 main battle tanks, moving south at 35 kilometers per hour on the Shareza Highway toward the city. CENTCOM's J2 immediately identified the column as elements of the IRGC's 88th Armored Division, stationed at the Shahid Babai base complex northeast of Isfahan. They were moving toward the nuclear site, not to defend it from American attack, to escort the uranium out. The IRGC commander on the ground had apparently reached the same conclusion as CENTCOM. Tunnel Complex Alpha was going to be breached within hours, and whoever got there first was going to own the most strategically valuable 450 kilograms of radioactive material in the history of modern warfare. It was now a race. At 0317 hours, General Barros made a second call to the Situation Room and delivered 4 more words. We need to accelerate. The 82nd Airborne launch was moved up by 40 minutes. 8 C-17 rolled from their hard stands at Al Udeid simultaneously, their 4 Pratt & Whitney turbofans shaking the tarmac, carrying the lead elements of 3/504 Parachute Infantry Regiment, the Red Devils, in full combat load with M4A1 carbines, AT-4 anti-armor rockets, and IVAS enhanced night vision goggles that turned pitch darkness into a daylight tactical display. At 0341 hours, the MC-130J carrying Wraith 1 crossed the Iranian border at 180 feet above the desert floor, invisible to every functioning Iranian radar system within range. The Growlers had done their job. The electromagnetic spectrum over central Iran was a blizzard of noise and deception. Iranian air defense operators staring at their screens were seeing hundreds of ghost contacts, their fire control computers looping endlessly in confusion, unable to discriminate between real aircraft and the digitally generated phantoms being injected into their radar returns by the Growlers' jamming pods. 6 minutes later, Wraith 1 reached the drop zone. The Delta Force element fast roped into the darkness from 30 feet, hitting the rubble field of the Isfahan complex's western perimeter in 2 teams of 30. Team Alpha moved immediately to Entry Point Whiskey 3, the excavation site where Iranian engineers had been digging. Team Bravo established a 360-degree perimeter along the rubble field's northern approach, facing the direction the IRGC armor column was coming from. They had the tunnel entrance, but they had a problem. The Iranian excavators hadn't just been digging for 72 hours, they had been digging for 96. CENTCOM's initial thermal analysis had underestimated the rate of penetration through the rubble matrix. When Team Alpha's point man swept his weapon-mounted thermal scope into the tunnel entrance at Entry Point Whiskey 3, he didn't see an empty passage. He saw 4 IRGC engineering soldiers standing 20 meters inside the tunnel, holding AKM assault rifles staring directly back at him. They had already breached the outer door of Tunnel Complex Alpha. The firefight that followed lasted 8 seconds. The Delta Force soldiers, operating in near-total darkness with integrated visual augmentation system headsets that rendered the tunnel in full 3D thermal relief, eliminated the 4 Iranian engineers before any of them could raise their weapons to fire. It was ruthlessly precise. It was also the moment that turned Operation Iron Vault from a stealth extraction into an active combat incursion on the sovereign territory of a country fighting the United States. Inside Tunnel Complex Alpha, the layout matched the pre-mission briefing almost exactly. The Delta operators moved through a 60-meter reinforced concrete passage past the destroyed remnants of centrifuge cascades, hundreds of meters of carbon fiber rotors still lining the walls like the bones of some enormous industrial animal, toward the primary storage vault at the tunnel's end. The vault door was a 40-centimeter thick, hardened steel blast door, Iranian manufacture, rated to withstand a 1,000-pound conventional bomb detonation at 10 meters. The Delta team's demolition specialist placed a shaped charge on the hinge mechanism, and 90 seconds later, the door was open. Behind it were 28 storage cylinders, each 1.8 meters tall, each containing UF6, uranium hexafluoride, enriched to 60.3% U-235 purity. The cylinders were marked in Farsi. The Delta team's embedded nuclear materials expert, a civilian from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency carrying the rank insignia of a lieutenant colonel for legal cover, swept each cylinder with a Geiger-Müller survey meter. All 28 were intact. No radiation leak, no contamination. Total uranium content, 447 kilograms, 11 nuclear weapons, sitting in a tunnel under rubble in the middle of an active war zone, 40 kilometers from an approaching armored column. Team Alpha had exactly 34 minutes to extract those cylinders before the IRGC 88th Armored Division arrived. And the extraction protocol called for the cylinders to be loaded into nuclear-certified transport containers. 7 Konex-style Type B transport casks, each capable of holding 4 cylinders, and then airlifted by CH-47F Chinook helicopters operating from a forward assembly area 8 kilometers west of the complex. 2 Chinooks were already inbound. NOE, nap of the Earth, flying, blacked out, guided entirely by GPS and FLIR. Team Bravo, meanwhile, was watching the IRGC column approach on the Joint Stars feed being relayed in real time to their IVAS displays. The lead T-72 was now 14 kilometers out. At 0419 hours, the Chinooks landed in the rubble field. Loading began. It took 22 minutes to load all 7 transport casks onto the 2 Chinooks. The Delta operators worked in silence, each cylinder requiring 2 men to move, each container requiring a radiation technician to seal and verify. The DTRA specialist was running a dosimeter continuously. The tunnel had elevated background radiation from the years of uranium processing, but the sealed cylinders themselves were not leaking. At 0441 hours, the last transport cask was secured aboard Chinook 2. At 0443 hours, Team Bravo's lead element reported armor 3 kilometers north, closing at speed. At 0444 hours, both Chinooks lifted. What happened in the next 4 minutes would be debated in every war college in the world for the next decade, as the 2 CH-47Fs climbed to 500 feet and turned west toward the forward assembly area. The lead element of the IRGC armored column reached the northern perimeter of the Isfahan complex. The column commander, whose radio communications were being intercepted in real time by an RC-135V Rivet Joint Signals Intelligence aircraft orbiting 60 kilometers to the west, apparently had no idea the uranium was already gone. He was transmitting urgent requests for engineering unit status updates and receiving no answer because the 4 engineers at the tunnel entrance were dead. By the time he understood what had happened, the Chinooks were 7 kilometers west and climbing through 1,200 feet. The IRGC commander did something that Operation Iron Vault planners had assessed as a 15% probability scenario. He fired a MESOG 3-man portable air defense missile, a MANPAD, at the receding thermal signature of Chinook 1. The Chinook's AN/AAQ-24 Nemesis directed infrared countermeasure system activated automatically, flooding the missile seeker head with a modulated infrared beam that broke its guidance lock. The MESOG 3 detonated 80 meters behind the aircraft, the blast wave rocking it but causing no structural damage. 4 IRGC T-72s then opened fire with their 125mm smoothbore main guns at the Chinooks at extreme range. the rounds falling well short as the helicopters accelerated and descended back to terrain-masking altitude. Simultaneously, the two AC-130W Stinger, two gunships that had been orbiting at 18,000 feet above the complex for the past 47 minutes, rolled into a firing run. Each aircraft's 30mm Bushmaster chain gun and 105mm howitzer opened fire on the lead vehicles of the IRGC column in a precisely coordinated strike that destroyed 3 T-72s and stopped the column's advance in 90 seconds of sustained fire. The remainder of the column withdrew north at maximum speed. The Chinooks landed at the forward assembly area at 0451 hours. At 0514 hours, two C-17 Globemasters, specially configured with lead-lined cargo compartments, landed at a classified airfield in western Iraq, and the 7 transport casks containing 447 kilograms of Iran's nuclear material were transferred from the Chinooks to the aircraft. At 0609 hours, the C-17S took off and turned west. At 1142 hours, they landed at a U.S. Air Force installation in Europe. The enriched uranium, enough for 11 nuclear weapons, was officially in American custody. The aftermath unfolded in real time before a stunned global audience. Iranian state television broadcast footage of the wrecked IRGC vehicles at the Isfahan perimeter and claimed the United States had stolen the property of the Iranian nation. Supreme Leader footage, pre-recorded, was released calling the operation an act of war against the entire Muslim world. In the UN Security Council, Russia and China immediately called an emergency session and introduced a resolution condemning the operation as a violation of Iranian sovereignty. The United States vetoed it in 4 seconds. Secretary of State Rubio held a press conference at 0900 hours Washington time. His statement was 14 words long. Iran will never build a nuclear weapon. The mission is complete. Thank you. No questions were taken. In the weeks that followed, the geopolitical landscape shifted in ways that no analyst had fully predicted. Iran's hardline faction, stripped of its nuclear deterrent and facing an ongoing air campaign that had already destroyed 8,000 military targets, fractured. 2 IRGC regional commanders publicly contacted U.S. intermediaries to discuss terms. The Houthis, who had just entered the war, went silent within 72 hours of the uranium seizure, apparently having received private assurances from their Iranian patrons that Tehran's military capability had been fundamentally altered. But the US soldiers on the ground knew something the press conferences and UN speeches would never fully capture. In the tunnel beneath Isfahan, by the light of weapon-mounted torches, surrounded by the physical wreckage of a nuclear program that had consumed 40 years and billions of dollars and now lay in ruins, in that silence, with 447 kilograms of the world's most dangerous material loaded into black transport casks and ready to fly out of Iran forever, the mission commander had knelt down and pressed one hand against the cold concrete floor of the tunnel. Then stood up, turned to his team, said nothing. They all knew, every one of them. The world had just changed. Not with a nuclear detonation, not with a war declaration. With 60 Delta operators, 2 Chinooks, and 22 minutes in the dark. The Strait of Hormuz remains volatile. The Houthis have re-entered the conflict. Russia is photographing US bases in Saudi Arabia. And somewhere in the mountains of western Iran, IRGC engineers are already attempting to locate the third tunnel. The one that wasn't on any IAEA inspection report. Because Iran kept a secret, and now America knows it. The next 48 hours will determine whether this war ends with a negotiated surrender, or a second phase that no analyst, no general, and no president has fully prepared for. What do you think? Could Iran really still have a hidden enrichment site that survived 5 weeks of bombing? Comment your analysis below, and if you believe Trump will authorize a second ground operation, or if you think the uranium seizure forces Tehran to finally negotiate, hit that like button and subscribe, because the next classified file opens in 48 hours, and the headline is going to shock you.